The people who raised you are sometimes the last ones you should trust. And the day I proved that cost me everything I thought I knew about love, but gave me back the one thing I'd spent 31 years searching for, myself. I need you to stay with me, because what happened after my father sent that text is something nobody in my circle has ever spoken about out loud. And it changed the architecture of my entire life in ways I still feel in my chest at 3 in the morning. My name is Vesper Calloway, and I graduated from Harwick School of Engineering on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the sky was that specific shade of pewter that sits just before a storm decides it has nothing left to prove. I stood at the edge of the auditorium stage with a rolled certificate in my hand and a bobby pin digging into the back of my skull, scanning the rows for a face I recognized. Not one. Not a single familiar jawline. Not a single pair of eyes looking back at me with anything resembling pride or recognition or even mild curiosity. The entire fifth row, which I had reserved, called about, confirmed twice, and sent a reminder card to, was occupied by strangers who'd arrived early for someone else's ceremony and simply refused to surrender their seats. My mother was in Tallahassee attending a cousin's baby shower that had been scheduled 5 times before it finally stuck. My brother Caden was at a fantasy football draft. I know because he texted me at 11:47 that morning. "Sorry, bees can't make it. The draft got moved to today." You understand. I did not reply. My father, Darren Calloway, real estate agent, Sunday griller, man who had told every person at every backyard gathering for the past 7 years that his daughter was going to be an engineer, was nowhere. No text, no voicemail, no envelope slipped under my apartment door that evening. Nothing. Just absence in the shape of a man I had been trying to make proud since I was 11 years old and built a model bridge out of balsa wood that held 42 pounds before collapsing, and he'd said, "Nice try," and gone inside to watch the game. I took my photograph alone. The school offered a photographer, a young man named Ovid, according to the laminate badge swinging from his lanyard, who had the look of someone working his 3rd event of the day and still managing to be kind about it. I gave him my phone. He asked me to hold the certificate up slightly and angle my chin toward the window light. He took 3 shots and showed me the screen. In the first one, my eyes looked hollow. In the second one, I was blinking. In the third, I looked like someone who had just arrived at a conclusion that had taken a long time to reach. Tired, clear-eyed, and done with something. "That one's good," Ovid said. "Yeah," I said. "That one's honest." I thanked him and walked through the thinning crowd toward the exit, passing clusters of families doing what families do at these events. Photographs in front of every possible surface. Fathers with their hands on their sons' shoulders, mothers pressing cheeks against daughters, grandparents sitting in folding chairs at the edge of the room with expressions of patient, complete joy. I moved through all of it with the particular invisibility of someone who has no one to navigate toward, and I pushed open the heavy door at the back of the building and stepped into the rain that had finally made its decision, and I walked to my car, and I sat in the driver's seat for approximately 9 minutes without turning the key. I was not crying. I want to be precise about that. There is a particular state that sits just on the near side of tears. Pressurized, still, aware. And I was in that state, turning the rolled certificate in my hands, watching rain trace uneven lines down the windshield like they couldn't agree on a path. Then I drove home to my husband. Rafferty was on the couch when I walked in, still in his work clothes from the morning because he'd come home early to cook dinner. He had made pasta, not from a box, actual pasta he'd rolled himself, with a sauce that required 3 hours of simmering. He had a bottle of something from a vineyard in Sonoma sitting open on the counter. He looked at my face and he didn't say a word. He just stood up and pulled me into him and held me there in the doorway while rain fell sideways against the kitchen window, and I felt the certificate bend slightly in my grip. We ate dinner. He poured the wine. He asked me to tell him every single thing I remembered from the ceremony: the name of the dean who mispronounced 3 surnames in a row, The woman ahead of me in the procession who'd lost a heel on the stairs and kept walking without breaking stride. The impossible acoustics of a room designed for lectures rather than celebrations. He listened to all of it. He did not say, "At least you have me." He did not say, "They don't deserve you." He simply made space for all of it and let it exist without trying to fix the shape of it. That night, I called my mother. She said she was sorry she'd missed it, in the tone people use when they've forgotten to return a library book. She asked if I'd gotten the card she'd mailed. I had not. She said the postal service was terrible lately. I agreed. We talked for 4 minutes, and then she said she had to get up early. The weeks after graduation moved the way weeks do, when nothing is broken, but nothing is quite right either. Slowly, with an odd texture, like walking on ground that keeps shifting slightly underfoot. I threw myself into work. The firm I'd been interning with, Solvang and Marchetti, a mid-sized structural consultancy with offices above a parking garage downtown and an espresso machine that required specific coaxing, offered me a full position, and I accepted it and spent my days running calculations on load distribution and stress tolerance and the exact weight a structure could bear before the math stopped working in its favor. There is something almost meditative about that kind of precision. The numbers either hold or they don't. They do not require reassurance. They do not need you to manage their feelings. They simply exist and either confirm or contradict what you believed about the world, and either way, you know where you stand. My desk faced a window that looked out over a rooftop 2 floors below, where someone had built a small and inexplicable garden. Clay pots with herbs, and one determined rose bush that had wound itself around an old satellite dish and seemed to be winning. I ate lunch at that window most days and thought about almost nothing, which was its own kind of relief. Rafferty would text me around noon most days. Not anything important. A photograph of something strange he'd seen on his commute. A question about what I wanted for dinner framed as a poll with 2 options. A single sentence about a conversation he'd overheard on the train. These texts were small and consistent, and they were, I understood gradually, a form of showing up, daily, undramatic, without request for acknowledgement or performance in return. I did not tell anyone at work about the graduation. There was nothing to say that wouldn't require explanation. An explanation required a version of the story I wasn't ready to curate yet. I didn't hear from my father for 19 days. Then, a text. "Hey Vesper, hope things are good. I need to ask you something. Can you call me?" I called him. "Your sister's getting married," he said, and his voice carried that particular warmth he reserved for conversations where he needed something. Winthia, my younger sister by 4 years, the one who had always known how to move through my parents' attention the way water finds the lowest path, was engaged to a man named Breckett, who drove a truck with a modified exhaust and had once told me, at a family dinner, that he didn't believe in evolution because it was just a theory, and had said it in a way that suggested he was proud of this opinion. "Congratulations to her," I said. "The thing is," my father said, "the venue requires a deposit by next Friday. And your mother and we've got some things tied up right now, some investments that aren't liquid yet." I waited. "We need $8,000, Vesper. I wouldn't ask if I had any other option. You know that." I did not know that, actually. What I knew was that my father had never once asked me how my engineering program was going. What I knew was that the last birthday card he'd sent me had arrived 11 days after my birthday with a $20 bill inside, because $20 was what he'd given me since I was 8, and it had never occurred to him to adjust for inflation or age or the fact that I was now a licensed structural engineer. What I knew was that the 5th row of an auditorium had been empty on the most significant afternoon of my professional life, and now, 19 days later, I was being asked for $8,000 for a wedding I hadn't been consulted about, for a sister who texted me maybe 4 times a year, by a man whose voice only carried warmth in one specific kind of conversation. "Let me think about it," I said. The deposit's due Friday, he said. I heard you, I said. We hung up. I went to Rafferty and told him everything. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, and he listened with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. And when I finished talking, he didn't speak for a long moment. What do you want to do? He said. I want to be done, I said. He nodded slowly. Then let's be done. I took out my phone. I opened the text thread with my father, a thread so sparse it scrolled up to a single message from the previous Christmas that said, Merry Christmas, with no punctuation. I opened a payment app. I typed in $8, 8 flat, no cents. In the memo line, I typed, Best wishes for the wedding. I sent it. Then I put down my phone and looked at Rafferty and said, I need you to change the locks tomorrow. He didn't ask why. He already knew. Had known for longer than I had, probably, the way people who love you clearly sometimes see the geometry of your life before you can. My parents had a key to our house. They'd had it since we moved in, given at my mother's insistence, because what if there's an emergency? A logic that seemed reasonable on the surface and corrosive underneath, because the key had never been used for emergencies. It had been used twice. Once, when my mother stopped by unannounced while Rafferty and I were at work and left a bag of cleaning supplies on the counter with a note that said, the house could use some attention. And once, when my father came by to borrow a ladder and returned it 6 weeks later without a word. The locks were changed by noon the following day. Rafferty handled it while I was at work, and when I came home that evening, there were 2 new keys on the kitchen counter, and the old world was, in some small and irreversible way, over. My father called that night. He did not mention the $8 for several seconds. He asked how I was. He asked about work. And then, in a tone I had never heard from him before, a tone that sat somewhere between confused and genuinely wronged, as though an equation he had trusted his whole life had suddenly produced an impossible answer. He asked what the $8 meant. It means best wishes, I said. Vesper. Dad. Silence. Your sister needs this wedding, he said. She's been planning it for... I sat in the 5th row alone, I said, for 3 hours, in a rainstorm, with a bobby pin in my skull. I had reserved seats. I confirmed twice. I sent a card. He was quiet. I graduated, I said. I finished a 5-year program and I graduated, and not one person from this family came. Caden had a fantasy football draft. Mom had a baby shower for a cousin I've met maybe twice. And you... I stopped, took a breath. You didn't even send a text. Vesper, that day was... I don't need an explanation, I said. I genuinely don't. I've stopped needing explanations. I sent $8 because that's the energy that's been in this relationship for a long time, and I'm finally letting the math be honest. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice that had hardened into something I hadn't heard before, Your sister is going to remember this. She'll have a lot of other things to think about, I said. She's getting married. We hung up. I expected my mother to call. She did, 2 days later, in a voice stretched thin with the specific kind of disappointment that requires an audience. She told me I had embarrassed the family. She told me Wynthia had cried. She told me that whatever I thought I was doing, I needed to think about the example I was setting. I asked her what example exactly she felt was being set by not attending my graduation. She told me I was being dramatic. I told her I loved her and that I needed some space. She said that was very convenient for me. We hung up. Rafferty made tea. We sat on the porch in the evening and listened to the neighborhood settle into its nighttime sounds, and I thought about load distribution, about how weight moves through a structure, how every beam and joint and connection point is part of a larger system, how if you remove what isn't bearing weight, the structure becomes stronger, not weaker, because it stops compensating for elements that were never pulling their share. I thought I was done. I was not done. 3 days later, a patrol car pulled up in front of our house. I was inside when Rafferty answered the door. I heard voices and came to the hallway and stopped. 2 officers stood on our front step. Rafferty was speaking in the measured, careful tone he used in situations that required him to be very deliberate. I walked to the door and stood beside him. My father had called a welfare check. He had told the police that he had reason to believe I was in distress, that I had been behaving erratically, that I had sent him a threatening message, that he was concerned for my mental state. He had used the $8 payment as evidence of erratic behavior. One of the officers, a woman named Delvaux, according to her badge, looked at me with the practiced neutrality of someone who had responded to many situations and learned not to decide anything before the facts arrived. She asked if I was okay. I said I was. She asked if there had been any conflict in the household. I said no, and looked at Rafferty, who confirmed it. She asked if I had sent a payment to my father recently. I said yes, $8, with a note, because he had asked me for $8,000. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if she could come inside and speak with me briefly. I said yes. Officer Delvaux came in. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at the pasta still on the stove from dinner, the good kind of evidence, garlic and olive oil and something that had simmered for a while. She looked at the engineering textbooks stacked by the couch. She looked at the framed photograph on the shelf, the one Rafferty had printed for me at a shop downtown, on actual photo paper rather than from a home printer, because he'd said it deserved to be a real photograph. My face in it was not devastated or broken or ashamed. My face in it was just tired and real and present, and I'd had mixed feelings about hanging it until this moment, when a stranger's eyes moved to it and found nothing alarming there. She asked me a few more questions. How long had I lived here? What my work schedule looked like? Whether there was anyone in my life I was currently in conflict with. I answered carefully and completely. She took notes on a small pad with a pen that barely worked, and she shook it twice to get the ink moving. And that detail made her seem more human, and the whole situation slightly more absurd, and I held on to both of those things. Then she closed the pad. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully decode. Not quite sympathy, not quite professional neutrality, somewhere in the corridor between the two. "Everything looks fine here," she said. "I'll close this out." She stood. She paused at the door. "For what it's worth," she said, "people call in welfare checks for a lot of different reasons." She didn't elaborate. She left. We stood in the doorway and watched the patrol car pull away in the late afternoon light, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not break, not crack, but shift, the way tectonic plates move, slowly and with enormous consequence, into a new configuration. "Are you okay?" Rafferty said. "I think so," I said. "I think I'm actually okay." The strange thing about building a life that can hold its own weight is that you don't always know it's working until something comes along and tests it. My father had done every version of this thing he knew how to do. The guilt, the silence, the money, the authorities, and I was standing in my own doorway in a house with new locks next to a person who had rolled pasta by hand to celebrate me, and I was okay. The structure held. I called my father one more time, about a week later. I told him I was not interested in a relationship built on transactions and appearances and conditional presence. I told him I wished him well, and I wished Winthia well, and I hoped the wedding was beautiful. I told him not to call the police on me again. He said I was throwing away my family. I said I was protecting one. He hung up. I haven't spoken to him since. That was 8 months ago. My mother and I exchange occasional texts, brief, carefully worded, the kind of communication that acknowledges a relationship without feeding it. Winthia got married in March. I wasn't invited, which was its own kind of answer to a question I hadn't needed to ask. Rafferty and I took a weekend trip to the coast in April. We rented a small house with a porch that faced the water, and we sat there every evening with coffee and let the silence be comfortable the way silence can be when you're with someone who doesn't need you to fill it. On the last morning, I watched the light come up over the water and thought about all the structures I'd studied: bridges, buildings, frameworks engineered to bear extraordinary pressure. And I thought about what it takes to hold. The answer is almost always the same. It's not how much you add, It's how honest you are about what was never actually load-bearing to begin with. I am a structural engineer. I know what holds and what doesn't.
I know the difference between a foundation and a facade. I have never been more certain of either. If this story hit something real inside you, like, subscribe, and let's keep building something worth staying for.